My name is Dave Morrow. 9 months of each year, I live out of my vehicle. I travel the wilderness by foot on an endless backpacking and landscape photography trip. I want to teach and share the photography and outdoor skills that I use on these trips. I don't want to spend hours editing video or sitting in front of a computer, so I made some rules. First, everything's shot on GoPro. This was the best way I found to record quickly on a consistent basis. Second, I can only spend 20 minutes editing each video. So thanks for watching, and welcome to the Landscape Photography Journals. So I've been hiking for about, 6 hours now, and I am in one of the large gulches in Utah that I've been wanting to explore for a while. So I'm packed up for 3 nights, and I'm going to be doing a lot of shooting up and down probably the 15 or 20 miles of this gulch towards the San Juan River. Normally when I come out, I'm looking for like a 3 to 5 day perfectly clear stint, because it's not like you can, in most cases, get up on the canyon top and shoot sunset. Oh, there runs a deer. There's 2 deer right there. It's probably hard to see them. They're right on the ridgeline. One's looking. If the metering on this GoPro wasn't so bad, it'd probably be easier to see. But I'm gonna walk around here and try to find a few cool compositions to shoot, and I'll do a walkthrough, step-by-step of thought processes and settings and stuff like that. So this is now direct light against the canyon wall, right back there. I'll bring this up. It doesn't always meter the best, but that's just sunlight coming in and hitting it. But since the sun's so low in the sky, it gives a really nice golden orange look. And I want to isolate it with this tree right here. Now, I'm still not sure if I like this composition that much or not. When the light was a little bit lower earlier, it kind of separated the tree from the bottom right here. But now that it's up a little bit higher, it kind of just goes through dead in the background of the tree. So I'll try one like this, and then I'll try one once the light completely goes above the tree and see how that looks. So I'm actually up on a big rock. See if you can see it. I was down there where my bag is, but I noticed that I couldn't see where the bottom of this tree trunk hit that horizontal line coming across. So even if I lower this, you probably notice that the bushes kind of get in the way in the tree trunk. So when I'm looking at different compositions, I want to have separation, meaning I don't have something getting in the way of where that tree trunk vertical line hits the horizontal line coming through the scene. It just breaks it up for the eye and makes it harder to see what's going on. So this is the area I'm talking about right here. It's kind of hard to see the separation between the tree and the background because the light doesn't cut down below it as it would have been a little bit earlier in the day. So that's why I'm almost tempted to wait till the light gets up above, and in the full wide angle composition you can see even higher up in here. Because this tree isn't really symmetrical, so I took this trunk of the tree and offset it from the center just a little bit so it would balance out this heavier side of the tree over here. And I also think the light over here is a little bit stronger, so it balances out this side as well. Now the other thing I looked for when I set this up was this nice cool blue colors down in here, which will be easier to see in the actual picture. Complement nicely with this yellow and warmer hues up here. So when you're thinking about specific colors, you have shadow colors, which are normally in the shadows. They're dark blues, dark greens, things like that. And they always complement things that are getting hit by direct sunlight, such as warm colors, such as this yellow up in here. So if you look at your color wheel, those blues and yellows lie directly across from each other. And that's just called color theory. So before we get started with the next part of this video, where I'm going to show you guys how to capture these images, I quickly wanted to state that this is an intermediate level video. So if you don't understand some of this stuff and you're just starting out, I'm not actually going to walk you through the specific settings which I dial into my camera. If you want to learn about settings and how I select them, you can watch the previous videos in this series, which I'll link below this video. The goal of this video is to show you guys the framework or methodology which I use to capture a high dynamic range scene, meaning a scene such as the one we're about to shoot with very bright areas, such as up here, and very dark areas down here. Now, I shoot with a D810, which has a very large dynamic range, meaning it could capture a lot of this dark detail down in the foreground, even if I'm just exposing for the highlights. The downside of this is that even though I do capture all of this dark detail, if I pull out the exposure that much to retain all that dark detail, the color is not as nice and there is slight noise compared to if I had actually exposed for this dark parts of the image. So when I'm shooting in a really high dynamic range scene like this, I'll dial in my exposure first for the highlights, and then I'll dial in another exposure which just captures the shadows. Now at times, I'll also take a third exposure for specific parts of the image. As I'll show you next, I took a last exposure just for these very dark plants down here, where I also refocused on that part of the scene. But many people use a technique called exposure bracketing. I'll pop back out here to the images. Now what exposure bracketing does is you can set up your camera so you can set in a specific single exposure, say for the highlights, and then the camera will take an exposure that is one stop darker than that, and then one stop brighter than that as well. You could also set your camera up so it will take the initial image, then 2 stops brighter or 2 stops darker as well. Now I don't prefer that method because I don't feel that it gives me precise control over each of the exposures. So what I like to do is I like to look at the scene. I'll first expose for the highlights, then I'll expose for the transition line between the highlights and the shadows, such as this right here, and then I'll take a third exposure, if required, to expose for any extremely dark parts of the scene. Then I have perfect exposures for each part of the scene, which I can layer up and then blend together in Photoshop for overall better color and less noise in the final image. So another point I want to make here before we get back to the shooting part of this video is that rarely do you really need exposure bracketing, especially for good full-frame cameras, especially Nikon and Sony cameras, which have great sensors, including large dynamic ranges. So if we look at this image, I shot this at sunset and I exposed for the highlights only up here. So I can easily get all the information I need out of this photo. I could just add some contrast, pull the highlights and the whites down, and adjust the color balance back to where I needed. And then I could also pull the shadows out if I needed as well. And that's just a quick edit. But you can see that I retained all of the dark detail as well as all the highlights without having to push the image too far. So the only time I really exposure bracket is when I'm shooting into direct sunlight or when direct sunlight is hitting something like a canyon wall very harshly. So test your camera out, grab this exposure slider, and see how much detail you can pull out of shadows like this without actually getting a lot of color, grain, and noise in the final image. Oftentimes you can pull a whole lot of detail out. That's where the exposure started, and I can go all the way up here before I start to see too much noise and color degradation. So it's all about testing your camera out and seeing how much shadow detail you can pull out of the image if you expose for the highlights. Alright, so let's get back to the shooting part. So let's go through these basic settings for this shot. You can probably see my live view pretty well by now. There's not too much glare. For this shot, it's very high dynamic range, meaning there's very bright portions and very dark portions. So I'm going to need to take 2 separate shots. First thing I need to do is get a shot for the highlights, exposing just for the highlights, and then I'll just increase my EV, or exposure compensation, to brighten up the image just for the shadows. So I can capture a larger dynamic range in 2 shots than I can in 1. So as always, I'm going to focus first. I'll focus right on this tree, center of attention, and also about just a little bit more than a third, between a third and a half into the image. And that's the approximate hyperfocal distance. So now that that's focused, I'm going to go with an f-stop of f11 here. That's going to keep my foreground sharp, my tree sharp, and those canyon walls sharp in the background. So everything will look nice and in focus. And I always shoot at f11, well, probably 95% of the time. So f11, ISO, that's at base or 100, all good to go there. Shutter speed doesn't really matter here. The tree's moving a little bit, so if it's blurry when I review it, I'll increase the shutter speed, but I think it'll be okay at 1/8 of a second. So I'm just going to pull up my histogram here, and I'm just going to push this all the way over to the right. But if I think about it, since I'm shooting red again, that's going to blow out the red channel if I push the RGB all the way to the right. So I'll just actually back it down a little bit. And I also verify, which isn't that accurate, but I look at my live view to make sure red's not blown out. And this exposure is only for the highlights up here. So that's the only part I'm watching. That's why I'm watching the highlights of the histogram as well. This dark parts of the histogram right here, which represents the bottom portion of this picture, we'll deal with in the next exposure. So I'm going to push the shutter button there. And review the image. Looks sharp. The red looks like it might be blown out though. So let's check the RGB. And we can see the red channel is barely blown out. I could probably recover that in post-processing, but instead of risk it, I'll just back down on the exposure compensation, 1/3 stop darker. And then I'll take another shot. I can see the red is no longer blown out. So that shot's good for the highlights. All the other channels are within their bounds, so that looks good. Next shot. The key here, at least when blending images, is to make the images easy to blend together. So if I took one shot that was just for the highlights, and then I went extremely bright on the foreground shot, the edge between the darks and the highlights that I have to blend together, being the edges of those leaves on the tree, are very hard to blend in post-processing. So this is what I do. I come up here to the edge that I'm going to blend, such as this edge right here. That's where my blend between the two images will be. And I'm going to zoom in on it. So when I'm looking at that, I can kind of see the nice contrast between the leaves and the highlights behind it, the lights and the darks. I'm going to increase my exposure compensation, leaving all the other settings the same. So I'm just going up on the exposure compensation, brighter and brighter. When I do that, I want to make sure that the leaves don't get blown out or that they don't turn to like an off-color green. So I can zoom in on them again. See how the leaves still look good there? They're nice and detailed and contrasted. Now the highlights are now blown out, just slightly because we went up in exposure compensation. If I go way up here, say like this, see how it almost makes the line of the leaves indistinguishable from the highlights in the background? That would make for a very hard blend in post-processing. So I kind of want to be on that fine edge between too bright and too dark. And I think this one's even a little bit too bright. All I'm doing is decreasing my exposure value. And now the leaves look good. They're not blown out around the edges. So I'm looking at this portion of the histogram here. It's now shifted from the darks area to the dark midtones, which is slightly lighter. So I'll take that exposure there. And I can use that one to blend this fine line right there between light and dark. Now the last thing I could do, if I really wanted to, since this part of my image in the bottom is much darker than the actual bottom of the composition in real life, I could come down here with my focal point, refocus just on that part of the composition, and when I do so I can always lighten it up as well. What that's going to do is give me a third exposure, which I can just blend in just for this parts of the image. That'll make sure that those colors stay really nice, and I also refocused when I did that, so they'll be even sharper than they would have before. So I'll just take that shot as well. Now I always want to check the focus after I'm done and make sure it's good. That looks good. Yeah, alright. So when I'm looking through these, all I'm asking myself is I'm actually going into like a post-processing mentality. I'm saying, how can I take these images with the best dynamic range but be able to easily blend them in post-processing? Well, the first one we looked at was just for the highlights. Then I knew there was a very harsh transition line between the highlights and the shadows, so I wanted to make that transition line easy to blend. So I took an exposure specifically to isolate the top of that tree and make sure that those would be really easy to blend in post-processing. Now, then I looked at the image again and I said, well, can I make anything better in the bottom portion of the image? Well, I could if I brightened it up and refocused. So that's just an extra step I took since I was already taking these. I can easily blend that one back through and have 3 overlaid images. It is now 7 p.m. I've been out for a long time today. That's why it feels long. Get up before sunrise this morning to shoot at the San Juan River. Just got my tent set up. It's right by that tree I was shooting at earlier. So I can shoot sunlight peeping in the side as well. But one-man tent tonight, running pretty light on gear because it's warm out. So 20-degree bag, which is the only bag I brought because it's pretty versatile, although I normally have like a 35 in the desert. Then the REI one-man tent, which is pretty small footprint. I like this tent. The only downside of it is that it is not a freestanding tent, meaning you have to have stakes in that and that, which I always like to have a freestanding tent. I think the newer model of this tent is freestanding. But I just showed my brother this trick the other day. This is a known trick to a lot of people. But let's say like you're trying to set up a tent and you're on rock or like hard pan, so you have nothing to stake it into. All you'd have to do is take your stake out right here and you just put it sideways. And you basically just put the rock on top of it. And sometimes you have to situate the stake so it pulls under the rock. So if you're like on hard pan or something you can't stake into, just turn your stake sideways, grab some big rocks, and then you can stake your tent down that way. So if you have a non-freestanding tent like this one, or it's windy out, then it's super easy to hold it down no matter what. I dig it. But I'm going to make dinner, ramen, and dried vegetables, and peanut butter, all mixed together. It's the shit. And wait for Moon to come up and do some more shooting later. Peace. So I live out of this thing full time when I travel. So it goes between driving this to new places and then backpacking in those new places once I get there. So I'm fully self-contained out of this. I can go mostly anywhere. So my goal here is to compress this scene in so you can see the log and then all these layers, and then the mountains will be at the very top of the composition.